Welcome everyone to this evening's webinar that is jointly hosted by the Australia Institute of International Affairs Queensland branch with UN Women Australia. Tonight we will be talking about intersecting crises and the impact for women in the Pacific. It's an honor for us today to have some experts on this from the UN Women Fiji Multi-Country Office, Pacific Women Support Unit, and the Executive Director of UN Women Australia. Janelle Weissman. Janelle is going to introduce our speakers from Fiji, but I wanted to first just introduce Janelle, who is, as I noted, Executive Director of UN Women Australia. And for the past 25 years, Janelle has worked to strengthen social justice organizations, tackling issues from women's empowerment through to supporting people with HIV/AIDS in the USA, Australia, and around the world. As a fundraiser, grant maker, and program manager, she has nurtured countless partnerships across the world. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Janelle, who will introduce the session and the speakers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am sitting today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. It's an absolute pleasure to have all of you join us today, and thanks again to Australian Institute of International Affairs for collaborating to put this evening's event together. I'll give you a bit of context to start about UN Women in the Pacific, and then we'll not spend much more time before I introduce the main event, which is our speakers tonight. So firstly, UN Women is the United Nations entity for gender equality and women's empowerment. And it's actually the youngest entity at the United Nations and the only entity that is dedicated exclusively to gender equality, arguably one of the most important mandates at the UN, given it's a cross-cutting issue. UN Women is celebrating its 10th birthday this year, and we are just thrilled to support that work as UN Women Australia. So we're the fundraising and advocacy arm for UN Women. If I were going to boil down what it is that we're all fighting for, it's for a world where every girl and woman everywhere has equal opportunity to lead, to learn, to earn a decent living, and to live a life free from violence and discrimination so that she can fulfill her full potential. UN Women Australia is probably best known for our International Women's Day events each March, and we are, as a part of the 10th birthday, organizing a membership drive right now. So if you'd like to join the largest movement for gender equality, check out our website, unwomen.org.au. Now, tonight, we're going to talk a bit about partnership, and we're going to talk about some of the challenges that are being experienced through multi-layered complex issues, including natural disasters, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. But I'd like to start by acknowledging the Australian government, which has for some time now had gender at the heart of its aid and development policy. And we are incredibly grateful for the long-standing partnership between UN Women and the Australian government, and believe that when you invest, not just believe, but know that when you invest in women, you reap dividends that support not just outcomes for women, but for whole families and communities as well. So on the screen is a map of the Pacific. I thought it would be useful to provide a bit of background around where it is in the world that we're talking about for those of you who may be less familiar. Pacific Island countries are among the smallest and most remote countries on Earth, with small, isolated economies. Costs of shipping and air transport are very high, which makes doing business in the Pacific incredibly costly. And agriculture is somewhat limited outside of larger landmass islands like Papua New Guinea, or multiple islands, Papua New Guinea and Fiji. Some Pacific countries are quite dependent on remittances and tourism, which has obviously been impacted by COVID-19. And some are also quite reliant on resource extraction as part of their economy. However, the string that holds everything together is every Pacific country is impacted by natural disasters, and we have seen an increase in frequency and severity of natural disasters, whether we're talking cyclones, tsunamis, volcanoes. It has a reverberating impact across the region. Now, when it comes to gender equality, there has been some impressive progress made as a result of tireless work, civil society, UN Women, support from governments, and investments from many. For example, 4 Pacific states now have dedicated ministries for women, and almost all countries have a roadmap to achieve gender equality, as well as dedicated departments focusing on that. In the last decade, 13 Pacific Island countries have passed legislation on domestic and family violence, thanks to lobbying by civil society and government. However, it is well known that the Pacific has some of the highest rates of violence against women and girls anywhere in the world. We also know that in the Pacific, we see some of the lowest representation of women as leaders, and that's across levels, so from parliament through to provincial levels of government and at the community level as well. Now, within this context, we can all appreciate progress on gender equality is both pressing and challenging. When it comes to COVID-19, the remoteness of many Pacific Island countries has actually been a protective factor. Many countries closed borders early on, began quarantining suspected cases. However, health systems in the region are not adequately equipped to respond to major outbreaks. COVID-19 is having a disproportionate impact on women and girls, and that's in part what we will talk about tonight. But the compounding impacts of COVID-19, combined with ongoing climate and disaster shocks on Pacific Island countries, will pose major challenges for years to come. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the main event, our speakers for this evening. We will, in terms of process, be kicking off with a presentation by my colleague Sandra Bernklau, followed directly by a presentation by Chetty, and then we will get to the question and answer portion where we want to hear from all of you. So, it is my pleasure now to introduce Sandra Burnclow. She is the representative for UN Women's Fiji multi-country office covering 14 Pacific Island countries, providing technical advice and support to advance gender equality. Sandra comes to us with over 25 years of experience in the field of gender and human rights development work. I will also now introduce Tara, so we have seamless movement to our speakers' presentations. Tara has an extensive background working for feminist and human rights organizations in Fiji. In her current role, Tara provides technical support to the Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development Program, Australia's 10-year initiative to support gender equality in 14 Pacific Island countries. Now, I would love to pass the baton over to my colleague Sandra. Over to you.
Sandra, you're on mute.
Sorry, and I'd started off so well. Warm Pacific greetings from Suva, Fiji, and the UN Women Office for the Pacific. Thank you so much, Sarah and Janelle, for your kind introductions. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let me just organize that. Okay. Sorry, a little bit of technical. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Okay, thank you. So thank you so much, Sarah and Janelle, for your very kind introductions, and also to the Australian Institute of International Affairs for this opportunity. And thank you also to my co-panelist, Chetty from Pacific Women. Just a brief on the UN Women Office for the Pacific. We do have one of the largest UN Women presences globally. And this is really due to the fact that our partners in the region, in particular the Government of Australia, really promote, support, and prioritize work on gender equality and women's empowerment in the Pacific. So our key programmatic areas, we align them with both global priorities, but more importantly, we really focus on the priorities of Pacific Island governments. And our program focus areas are on ending violence against women and girls, women's economic empowerment through the Markets for Change project, gender and resilience, disaster risk reduction, as well as humanitarian action, and women's empowerment and political leadership, and what we call our normative work, that is supporting governments to comply with international standards on gender equality. We work across 14 Pacific Island countries. We have offices in 6. We currently have around 53 staff members, the majority of which are Pacific Island nationals. Now, as Janelle has mentioned, Pacific Island countries face particular and unique challenges as small island developing states. Dispersed populations, narrow economies. Some of the countries are heavily reliant on tourism and remittances. And while there's been some great progress on gender equality over the last decade, there does remain to be some key challenges, such as the high rates of violence and the low rates of women in leadership. Just moving to my second slide. So within this context, this year in March and April, we experienced both COVID-19 as well as Tropical Cyclone Herald. So Tropical Cyclone Herald started storming through Solomon Islands, made landfall in Vanuatu on the 6th of April, and then headed to Fiji and Tonga. It was a Category 5 cyclone, the strongest category. And so it was a Category 5 when it hit Vanuatu, and it continued to be a Category 5 when it hit also Fiji and Tonga. It destroyed houses, agricultural produce, and infrastructure, and the recovery following Tropical Cyclone Herald is going to be ongoing for a very long period. So it was at the height of COVID-19 lockdowns in the Pacific, when Tropical Cyclone Herald hit. Vanuatu was faced with the choice of leaving people vulnerable to the cyclone or moving them to evacuation centers, risking exposure to COVID, and it's going to continue to devastate Pacific economies for a very long time. I'm extremely proud of the whole Pacific team at UN Women, despite really difficult circumstances, immediately put in place measures across multiple countries, supporting key partners and stakeholders in immediately addressing safety concerns related to COVID-19, in gender-based violence with government and frontline service providers and crisis centers, and also with market vendors and market management, who are really the cornerstone in the Pacific of food security and livelihoods. On the screen, you'll see some examples that were immediately put in place, such as emergency service delivery protocols on gender-based violence, and IEC materials and plans for markets out of our Markets for Change project. In the Pacific, also, UN Women heads the protection cluster under the UN Humanitarian Response System. So what that means is at the country level, we provide support to our national counterpart of ways. So protection cluster, and in other countries, we support through programs such as the Gender and Equality of Risk Project, which is funded by the Government of Australia. Now, the protection cluster regionally has over 29 members and observers. UN agencies, Unity and PIFs, civil society organizations. It's really a challenge to coordinate, but the value in this mechanism is that governments are supported in a more organized and coordinated manner. And through the cluster mechanism, we can really see where the gaps are and who is being left behind. For example, disability organizations, LGBTQIA+ organizations. When they're left out, we can use the protection cluster mechanism to provide a space to lobby for inclusion. So one good example was following Tropical Cyclone Herald, the post-disaster needs assessment teams in Fiji and Vanuatu. The protection clusters really made sure that there was protection cluster members in each of those assessment teams. So they were really looking out during the assessments to make sure women, children, persons with disabilities, rural and remote persons were included in the assessment data. As we know, the Pacific is in a constant cycle of disasters. We're always in one phase of prevention, preparedness, response, resilience. So one of the positive things about our programming is it already straddles that nexus between development and humanitarian work. And it does so through a gendered lens. Having this built into our programming really allowed us to respond quickly, adapt and scale up our interventions in response to both TC Herald as well as COVID-19. Now, let's be honest, nobody was expecting COVID-19. This is not the normal disaster in the Pacific. So it really was a solid test of our programming adaptability. Now, we know globally the physical shutdowns and economic impacts of COVID increased already high rates of violence against women and girls, and that is particularly true for the Pacific. We already have high rates of violence. For example, the calls to the Fiji domestic violence hotline increased from 87 calls in February to 527 in April. The UN Women's Ending Violence Program is part of a larger program, the Pacific Partnership to End Violence. That's a regional program that brings together a wide range of partners on prevention and essential services. And it's a joint partnership with the Pacific Community and the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. So the Pacific Partnership team immediately worked with governments and partners at national levels, addressing problems, bringing in technically robust solutions, and an immediate need was, keeping life-saving services open and supporting service providers to transition to remote service provision. Extremely critical, as you know, the rates of violence increased. For this team, this meant further adaptation of what we call our gender-based violence multi-sectoral response and referral pathways. Quite a mouthful, but basically this is multi-ministry, multi-partner responses working between the ministries of women, health, justice, civil society, development partners, and other service providers, all agreeing on how to handle gender-based violence cases at the national level. No easy feat, especially during an emergency period. And the team also provided direct support to crisis counseling and safe shelters, and supported the transition to mobile counseling, online counseling with frontline service providers, developing content for online training and tools, as well as providing technical and funding support for gender-based violence communications and IEC materials for COVID-19. As the Pacific Partnership Program also builds around disaster preparedness, response, and resilience, the program was able to quickly reprogram 2.8 million of its budget to respond to TC Herald and COVID-19. And a very big thank you to our donor partners to, support that adaptability in our work. COVID-19, as you know, has also impacted women's livelihoods dramatically in the Pacific and will continue to do so in the medium and long term. Markets for Change is our women's economic empowerment program, principally funded by the Government of Australia through the Pacific Women Program. And since the project has also expanded to include support from Canada and New Zealand, and UNDP is a key partner as well. And like the Ending Violence team, the Markets for Change teams in Vanuatu, Fiji, and Solomon Islands worked with partners in immediately problem solving and providing technical support. In the markets, the teams supported market management COVID-19 planning frameworks that made sure that markets could continue operating and keep the vendors and customers both safe. The team also undertook a rapid assessment of water and sanitation and hygiene activities, deployed WHO-approved communications and training materials, and some of the initial work was around working with governments to make sure markets stay open as critical services. That's really important for livelihoods as well as food security. Other actions included working with the market vendors associations on keeping market vendors safe, so with safety messages and improved health and hygiene practices, including spacing related to COVID-19. So with COVID-19 sort of contained in Fiji for now, and we have no other recorded cases in the other Pacific Island countries, the focus is really now on the medium to long-term economic impact. As we all know, the Pacific has lost a great deal of tourism revenue. There's been a lot of job losses around the countries. And markets are really critical places. They're already used as social safety nets, and this social safety net is now being stressed as more vendors are coming in, people who have lost jobs are coming into the markets. So it's resulted in crowding in the markets and an overall drop of revenue for all of the vendors. We're also hearing from market vendors that they have to move to different markets because the markets that they're in used to sell to the tourism, hotel facilities. So we've been surveying the market vendors, and over 87% of those surveyed have said that their income has dropped by at least a half, if not more, since COVID began. And this is, of course, compounded by days of shutdowns, reduced space, and increased competition in the markets, and also increased costs such as transportation. So the decline in vendor incomes has and will have a serious impact on the health and well-being of women in the informal sector. And many of those vendors that have been surveyed said that if this continues, they will start soon experiencing problems in buying just food supplies for their family. So the project moving forward is going to be looking at supporting the market vendors with accessing finance, credit, diversifying products. All of these things are critical, but longer term solutions will require diversification of Pacific economies. So some of the key challenges that we're facing right now is this planning around the uncertainty. We have no idea how long this situation will continue. We're estimating that Pacific economies will be negatively impacted for many years. So we realize it's a marathon, not a sprint. We have already reprogrammed our work to respond to COVID, and we want to continue to do that in the long term, and that will require long-term solutions as well as long-term funding support. We've also been hit by what I'm calling cheekily a pandemic of studies. We've had lots and lots of requests for data and an emphasis on studies, and right now we really need to focus and devote our energy and funding to service provision, to reach out to people who need those services the most. There's also a real need to continue to have the resources to push for inclusion across multiple fronts, supporting women, persons with disabilities, rural persons, LGBTQIA+ communities as well. On the positive side, the COVID period has really taught us that we can provide a lot of services remotely. And this will have a long-term positive impact of getting services remotely out to rural and remote locations. And the experience has also shown us that, you know, our approach in terms of making sure that we always plan in disaster preparedness, risk, response, and resilience into all of our Pacific programming, that's the right way forward. And I think the experience is also going to force Pacific governments to relook at their economic models. And our challenge will be to push to make sure that women are at the table as leaders, you know, in all of these spaces and be part of these decisions and participate in economic planning moving forward. I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you to the people in the Government of Australia, our biggest partner in the Pacific, and of course, a longtime supporter of gender equality work. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Sandra, for the presentation. I was enjoying it so much I forgot I was going next almost. But that was a really wonderful, comprehensive overview of the amazing work that the UN Women Pacific Office is doing in many parts of the region. And of course, being part of the work for gender equality here in the Pacific, and also just being colleagues in the women's movement here in Fiji and more broadly, it's been wonderful to have the opportunity to work closely with you and you know, the members of your team, and so lovely to be able to share some of that work here with you this evening. So I'm waffling on as I find how to share my screen. Here we go, just a moment, bear with me. There we are. All right. So I thought it might be helpful just to kick off with a quick picture of what Pacific Women is, because it's involved in a lot of the work that's going on around the region, but not many people know what it is. So it's basically Australia's gender equality program in the region, and it's connected to the commitment by Pacific leaders through the Pacific Forum back in 2012, through the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration. So it's a 10-year commitment going to 2022, working across the Forum countries. And it's a bit bigger than Ben-Hur. There's 171 initiatives that's being delivered by over 160 partners, which include, of course, at UN Women, but also other large partners like SPC RRT, the Pacific Regional Rights Resource Team, or other parts of the Pacific community, as well as some of the smallest organizations doing critical work to support women on the ground. At the support unit where I work, we have the privilege to be involved with many of these partners. The program works across 4 areas. So some of our work in ending violence against women, where we coordinate closely with UN Women in supporting partners in the region. There's work on women's economic empowerment, leadership and decision making, and the overarching work on building an enabling environment for change. So that's, for example, many of the partners who've done the groundwork on legislative reform. And why I'm mentioning it is that this work on gender equality continues to be critical in the COVID-19 response, as Sandra so rightly pointed out, that we've seen that in parts of the region where the frameworks are in place to support gender equality, where there's a robust women's movement that is being resourced and supported, they've been much better able to organize, to adapt to COVID-19 and the associated intersecting crises than where other parts of the region where that work is still emerging or where it's faced severe setbacks in recent years. So that kind of ongoing foundational work towards gender equality is really part and parcel of a core response to COVID-19 here. Just a quick mention of some other aspects of the work that are relevant. One of them is Pacific Girl, which falls under Pacific Women. It's an initiative focused on 6 countries, which is attempting to reach adolescent girls aged 10 to 19. And this has been critical for us at this time because through these partners in places like Vanuatu, Fiji, and the Federated States of Micronesia, among others, we've been able to really hear about the experiences that are specific to adolescents and therefore the particular needs and responses that they require. We've also been privileged to work with the Fiji Women's Fund, who's reaching women in rural and remote areas of Fiji, as well as Balance of Power, which is working on women's leadership, including through this response time. So Sandra's already really touched on this in a very comprehensive way, but I thought I would just add in a little further information or perhaps a snapshot with all the scary red arrows to have a look at what is it that we're seeing for Sandra and I and our colleagues working across the region and in our conversations with women and the organizations and the governments that they're working with. We're really seeing some significant impacts and very quickly. While the virus itself is not deeply entrenched in the region as a disease, the impact of the pandemic is massive. And Sandra's touched on some very critical issues like the increase in gender-based violence. Tonga and Fiji have clearly reported on that increase, whereas others, more worryingly, are reporting less reporting, which is an even bigger concern perhaps, because it may be showing us that women are having trouble accessing the services that they would normally be able to reach. But I wanted to touch a little on the care burden because this is one of the immediate impacts and it's being felt differently by women in different parts of the region, although across the board, women and girls are reporting a huge increase in the care burden. As people lose jobs, as people return perhaps to home communities in more rural areas, women are having to cater for larger families. Women are having to do multiple types of work. If they're still able to earn cash incomes, then they're doing that, as well as taking care of children who are home from school. We're finding that adolescent girls and young women in particular have been impacted as they're staying home from studies. As younger children are staying home from studies, they're facing a hugely increased care burden. In Fiji, the Fiji Women's Rights Movement recently did a quick assessment among young women and adolescents, and they found that that was one of the clearest impacts, that this idea of perhaps young women or adolescent girls having more time to engage in online learning or other forms of opportunity that maybe people have been discussing, it's really not bearing out. And particularly for girls and young women, of course, in rural areas where things like online learning access is really not available to them. This is a big concern. And just to give you an idea, for example, in rural Solomon Islands already prior to the crisis, unpaid care work and the care burden in the household, like childcare, food preparation, laundry, etc., even caring for the sick and elderly, was the primary barrier for them in terms of economic activity. And adult women were spending half of their day, so over 12 hours, on these types of tasks in rural areas. And young women, because of having care of infants, were actually reporting 23 out of 24 hours spent caring, if you count caring for infants during the night. Many of you who have would certainly count it as a 24-hour job. The other note perhaps worth mentioning here is around the migration and what that looks like in the Pacific in relation to the impacts of COVID-19, as well as other crises. In the North Pacific, there's a serious issue with drought, which of course, given that access to water and sanitation is critical for protection from the virus, these are critical issues. But what we're seeing in terms of migration is that people are moving as they've lost jobs. For example, in Fiji and Samoa in the tourism sector, they're moving back to more rural villages. In Fiji, they're moving out of the capital Suva and back to other places. Or they're even moving from tourist towns like Nandi across to larger urban centers like Suva in order to find income or to find food security. Because even in places where there is considered to be a much higher availability of food, like in food producing countries like Fiji, food security is certainly becoming an issue. And people who are already living on the margins, like in urban settlements, are reporting, being in a very vulnerable state when it comes to adequate nutrition and food security. So I might move on from this picture to think perhaps a little bit more about, well, what are many of our partners trying to do about this? So we've heard quite a bit about the efforts particularly UN Women in the Pacific has been doing to address the rising gender-based violence, which was already, let's face it, at incredibly and unacceptably high levels, where you're on average 2 out of 3 women have experienced forms of violence in their lifetime. So what we've been doing, and in the Pacific in particular, face-to-face, working together, building solidarity and exchanging learning and ideas is really the way that we work. So being isolated from each other and not being able to travel and be together to share learning has been particularly challenging for us because of our ways of communicating and our ways of learning. And that's why I think it's been really exciting, like you said, Sandra, that in fact, we have been finding ways to make this work despite our kind of preference for being together where possible. And one of the examples I wanted to share on the left of the slide, you can see some women from the Women United Together Marshall Islands. And they were together with women from the Chuk Women's Council in Federated States of Micronesia, had collaborated with the support unit here and some of the advisors working with governments in the region to do a remote telephone counselling course. So this is very similar to the work that UN Women has done in other places to help transition organisations to this remote service provision. But with our emphasis on support in the North Pacific, we were working with these 2 organisations. And I think what's critical about the space is it's not just about skills. It's not just about how do you deliver counselling remotely, how do you set up. These are very new services. Some of them were literally just launched before COVID came in. So, you know, it was both learning some of the advanced counseling skills as well as then learning how to pivot them and deliver them in a remote way. But beyond just the skills, it was an important space for solidarity for these women who are working on the front lines to get to know each other. And I think that's been a very important part of the spaces and the communication that the various parts of the gender and development world have been doing here in the region, led by, of course, women's rights activists from the region itself, because it can be very isolating, and Pacific peoples do travel quite widely for family connections, for work. And so these women, even as they're trying to serve the needs of women in the Marshall Islands, were themselves spread out and not able to be all together. One of them was stuck in the United States, as the North Pacific has that connection. So that's been really interesting, and really learning a lot from their experiences on the ground. There's also been very quick action to try and support emergency accommodation, for example, in Kiribati, and producing messaging which can really account for how we are experiencing the impacts of the pandemic here in the Pacific, and that is targeted and appropriate and delivering to the needs of women in different places, and also particularly to girls. Girls have often been treated as kind of just blanket recipients of information and just, you know, needing to practice good hygiene, but it's been quite a disempowering and isolating experience for girls across the Pacific. And it's been important to develop messages that also acknowledge their agency and give them back help to support their sense of control and their ability to, you know, have an impact on what is changing so rapidly in their lives around them. So that's been a critical part of it as well. And of course, as I said, the work is being led by some amazing women's rights activists, including through the Shifting the Power Coalition, which is operating exactly at the nexus of humanitarian response and gender equality. So they've been able to provide emergency grants to smaller organizations, to their partners in 6 countries around the region. And finally, as Sandra was mentioning, of course, the critical issue of women's livelihoods and economic security in a context where women are in the informal sector, so heavily represented in the informal sector, yet very often what we're seeing in the immediate government responses, including in places like Fiji, is that almost by necessity, they're quite focused on formal sector responses, using perhaps provident funds, superannuation funds, or other mechanisms, which women may either have much lower amounts that they can access, or, you know, they simply are not captured by those systems at all. So being able to document a bit of that in a light way and quickly share that learnings with colleagues, practitioners, and policymakers, so that we can really try and think through other innovative ways to reach women where they are. So I'm aware that I am talking a lot because it gets very interesting, but we should leave time for our discussion. And I can see Janelle smiling and saying, yes, please stop. So just to leave you with the final slide, we're trying to pull together some of the learnings and distill down some of the excellent work that has been done already elsewhere, and try and provide a little bit of fairly up-to-date information on what's happening in the region. So that's there on our website. There's a site there that you can access, and happy to share that later as well, along with any of those resources that are listed there. So on that note, I think I should probably give it back to you, Janelle or Sarah. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tara. I'll be chairing the Q&A, and as you know, at the bottom of your screen, you have a little box there for typing in the questions. But just to begin, we have one from Barbara Ward, who is from Fiji and working with the Fiji community. And she asked a question about how you think we can change the mindsets of Fijians. And specifically in that, what are the outcomes from the funding from Australia in relation to changing mindsets regarding women?
Well, thank you, Barbara, for the question. Maybe Tara, if it's all right with you, I'll have a go first. I think social norm change is an incredibly long process anywhere in the world. And, you know, social norms really mirror our traditional structures, our belief systems, and these are very entrenched and like many parts of the world in the Pacific, there are very patriarchal and hierarchical structures in place. So social norm change always takes a very long time. And I think that's been the benefit of Australia's investment in the Pacific, is that understanding that this is a long-term piece of work. Gender equality is not something that's going to change in a project or a 5-year strategic note cycle. This is going to take long-term generational change. And I think there's also been the benefit of support to programmatic responses that are innovative, that are trying new things. And Australia, as well as the EU and New Zealand, have been very great about supporting, for example, prevention of violence strategies. So the Pacific Partnership, and that's, you know, again, the partnership with Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat and the Secretariat of the Pacific Communities Regional Rights Resource Team, we call RRRT, who are fantastic, working together, you know, in supporting civil society, working with faith-based organizations, working with sports, working with educational facilities, working also in outside of the project, but jointly together in concert on legislative change and implementation of that. So, you know, you really have to look at things in a multi-pronged approach. So, you know, social norm change is going to take a long time. We have to be innovative. We also have to have long-term sustained approaches. And I think working with, you know, education, faith-based organizations and sports, which are all very key to Pacific Island society, will go a long way to changing those social norms and attitudes towards women and gender equality. And that will lead to changes in behavior moving forward. Maybe Tara, over to you to add.
Thanks, Sandra. That was great. I agree. You know, I think that we're on the right track, Barbara. I think that if we reflect, you know, growing up here in Suva, what you could talk about 30 years ago it's really different now, you know, and that does reflect that long-term consistent support and long-term consistent activism by the women's movement here. So, you know, 30 years ago, the way you could talk about violence against women, well, you couldn't. And now you know, that's just part of the mainstream policy dialogue. That's an accepted reality. It's acknowledged and it's discussed and it's addressed at a policy level as well as in many fora. I think the difference is, and what we need to consider is that, as with other forms of inequality, there is definitely uneven progress, even within Fiji, and also uneven progress across the different parts of the region. And that's something that I think a lot of people are working to address, but is really challenging. Like, gender equality is generational change. So it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but we've definitely come a long way during that time, and we expect to go further. And even with challenges like COVID-19 and other crises that put pressure on our countries, that do kind of then begin to close the space for dialogue and close the opportunity for shifting some of these norms. You know, it is something that you can come back to and continue to work on. So I agree, we're on the right track. And that's why it's exciting to be part of a program that's 10 years in length, like Pacific Women, because, you know, you can't achieve things in 2 years, but you can begin to see some change in 10 years. And where, for example, Australia's support for the Fiji Women's Crisis Centre over 30 years, you know, it's documented. You can see the considerable change that has been able to be done.
Great. Thank you. We have another question from Karen Baker, who directed both at Sandra and Tara, saying that there's clearly many gender challenges posed by the intersecting crises in the Pacific, but are there any opportunities that you see for promoting gender equality in this new context? And how might civil society support those opportunities?
Thanks, Karen, and great to see you online. No, there is some opportunities there. I wouldn't say there's silver linings, but there are some opportunities. And certainly we've already seen civil society really band together. There's, for example, in Fiji, there's a civil society COVID-19 working group that has formed and worked very closely with the government to do an immediate analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls in the Pacific. And, you know, that has been a fantastic resource. And using that, working with government, but also lobbying government to make sure that women are at the table when economic decisions and planning forward, you know, take place. And the women's movement has been very influential in that. And I think are working really tirelessly behind the scenes to do that analysis and to make sure they're at decision-making spaces. And so, for example, some of the work coming up on gender responsive budgeting across the Pacific, which will be and is led by civil society, looking at the costs of violence, for example, will be really instrumental to making sure that governments prioritize and plan and budget to keep services you know, operating for women and girls. And this is going to be even more critical in the COVID-19 period, where it will be very tempting for governments to remove money away from social sectors. So the strength of civil society right now and the influence they have is really, really important. And they've already showed that strength, certainly in Fiji and around the region, in making sure that they're at the table on it with the protection clusters, lobbying government to keep those services, to make sure to lobby government that women and girls are included in disaster preparedness and response actions. So civil society absolutely has a critical role to influence the outcome of COVID-19. And I'll hand over to Tara now.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I agree. You know, I think it's something that feminists and kind of, you know, political scientists, those working in this space, are really well aware of, that at times of huge crisis like this, that causes massive fractures in, you know, our societies, our way of organizing ourselves. It's terrible and painful, but it also means that with fracture comes an opportunity to remake. Maybe an opportunity to enter a new space. And like you said, Sandra, that's really critical when it comes to women's leadership in crisis response, women's leadership in these humanitarian spaces, and hopefully women's leadership then in serious core policy making, where women and civil society already are, but really now using this moment to perhaps expand that role. I think we've also seen that through having to respond really quickly during this time of crisis, governments, civil society organizations have really quickly absorbed new skills and quickly increased the reach of their services or their work, or formed really new productive alliances, the one you spoke of in Fiji, for example, but also elsewhere. It's often brought government and civil society in a kind of tighter, out of necessity, working very closely together. And I guess finally, just is this an opportunity as well to really reframe our economic thinking, to put the needs of women and girls and their communities really front and center in its truest sense, to think about how we can best serve them with the systems that we set up around them. Is this an opportunity to rethink some of that?
Great, thank you. So we have quite a few questions here. We're probably not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'll just go with one from Miles Young, who says, the Australian Parliament is holding an inquiry into the human rights of women and girls in the Pacific. If there are 1 to 2 key messages you'd like to pass on to the inquiry, what would they be?
Thanks so much for that question. Thanks, Miles. It's funny because we just did our submission today and we'll be sending it out. Yeah, so I think you know, one of the things that Australia has done well, as Tara has said, is investing in the long term, investing and also innovation as well, supporting innovation and adaptability and programming. As we learn, as we grow, and we see what works, and there's some very new areas such as prevention of violence strategies that haven't been fully tested in the Pacific. So definitely continuing the long-term investments, as Tara rightly said, it's generational change. And also to invest in Pacific institutions directly to lead those changes. I think we've got amazingly strong civil society organizations in the Pacific, also strong regional organizations in the Pacific as well. And those are the sustainable, you know, organizations to take this forward.
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks, Miles. Yeah, that's a great question. I agree, and I just want to reiterate that we know all the evidence tells us long-term core support for gender equality and the work to progress the rights of women and girls is what has worked and will continue to work and can't be disrupted. We also know from experience that context-specific, locally led approaches are really key. That Pacific women, Pacific communities really hold a lot of the answers when it comes to how we need to address our challenges in shifting social norms. And finally, I guess the third message I would say is we really need to strengthen our investment in girls. It's critical. They're particularly vulnerable. They've been made much more vulnerable by this crisis. But beyond that, you know, there's amazing capacity for leadership, for new and innovative ideas, and for kind of shifting the trajectory of how we're going as a region. So invest in girls and also work with boys. How are we going to work with girls and boys together?
Okay. Before handing it over to Janelle, I'll just allow for one more question, and this is about research on the younger generation of women, so young women. And if you're seeing in the research that they are articulating themselves, that they would like to aspire for leadership roles, and how they feel that they could achieve those leadership positions. And this is from Renee at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at Australian National University.
Thanks, Renee. That's a great question. We're not doing research right now into the younger generation of women in leadership, but we do have some leadership programs, such as the Women in Leadership Samoa, for example, and supporting also women participating in leadership training and provincial level women's congresses in Solomon Islands. So there is a really strong interest from young women to participate in leadership. And training, again, is not going to necessarily do it. It has to be training combined with social norm change, combined with other forms of support. So again, you have to have that really intersectional approach to women in leadership. And one of the things that we are strongly advocating for is developing programs that look at leadership at all levels. So a lot of leadership programs are looking just at elected women leadership at the national level, where we, you know, for example, we work with market vendors associations, and that develops leadership very much at the market vendor association level. You see some great leaders coming through that work. So there needs to be leadership at all levels. We need to maybe, you know, ensure that in the Pacific, people see women as leaders and see them, whether it's leadership in church organizations, unions, businesses. So, you know, outside of just elected leadership, we need to broaden that scope of leadership. And then I think we will get more pickup for women to aspire to you know, a diversity of leadership roles and positions. And that also will lead to social norm change later on. And I think for younger women, it's kind of daunting to run in elections, and it's almost financially impossible also. So we need to offer up other leadership forums for younger women to both get the skills and the mentoring and get the confidence to get out there and to change social norms throughout that process as well. Thanks.
Thanks. You've asked a question just like really close to my heart here. I'm very deeply interested in the young women's leadership movement that's happening across the region. I think specifically to your question around research, there have been a couple of, and are forthcoming, some surveys on perceptions of women's leadership, and it's quite interesting to look at the responses by age to that. So for example, the one that was done in Fiji in around 2012 or so, you can see that amongst younger women, there is certainly a stronger perception of the possibility to be a leader, the possibility that women are leaders. So that was quite interesting to see. But in terms of a kind of body of knowledge on young women's leadership in the Pacific, there's a lot out there. The partners, the 6 partners who work as part of Pacific Girl are just some of them, but partners like Talitha Project in Tonga, for example, works with adolescent girls specifically on leadership through sexual and reproductive health awareness. So it always has this element of voice, of empowerment, of amplifying girls' voices, while at the same time, as Sandra critically pointed out, working with parents, communities around that enabling environment for change, so that girls are not put at risk through kind of engaging in leadership programming that then is not supported once they leave the confines of that training space. So there's also a lot of research and body of work being done by the Fiji women's rights movement around young women's leadership, but also girls' leadership. And really, all of this excellent work, CARE in Vanuatu, their work in Tawhea province, it's all really informed by that principle of nothing about us without us. So rather than sort of a comprehensive, perhaps just a pure research approach, it's that adaptive thing of, well, what do you think? And then let's give that a try, and then coming back and adjusting as we go. Certainly that's the approach in Pacific Girl and many of these partners as well. So yeah, have a check, have a look at some of those partners for some of the body of knowledge that they've got around young women and girls leadership. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra and Tara. There's lots of really good questions in the stream. We're unfortunately just out of time on them. Hopefully we can engage in these questions in the future, and I'm sure that Sandra and Tara are available to answer some of these questions, but I'll turn it over to you, Janelle, and perhaps you can give some concluding remarks.
Yeah, really happy to. Look, rather than focus on the multiple and intersecting challenges that COVID-19 has posed in conjunction with natural disasters on women and girls in the Pacific, I'd like to just conclude with some of the stories of hope that came out of this discussion. And I think it's a really good place for us to focus our attention, our investment, and our energy. So we've heard about the promise of ensuring that young women and girls and women are at the table, that they really need to be driving this change, and that we're hopefully seeing some new spaces to create an opportunity for women to drive that change as leaders and agents of change as we look to a post-COVID community across the world. We also have seen lots of flexible innovation and adaptation, ensuring that services can continue regardless of them not being face-to-face, even if culturally that's the preference, that remote service delivery is effective and is a way for the future to ensure that in such a geographically dispersed part of the world as the Pacific, that we can continue to provide really important essential services for women and girls in new and different ways. And really just in conclusion, though, 2 other points: the importance of planning for risk and building resilience, that's part and parcel of the work that is happening in civil society through investments, targeted long-term investments for change from the Australian government and through UN Women's work as well. And that last point that you made, Tara, nothing about us without us, that we need to make sure that we're consulting those who are most vulnerable, whether it's people with disability, whether it's people who are older, whether it's young women, that we ensure that there is consultation and conscious inclusion of people in diverse voices. So I'd just like to thank again our panel members, Tara Chetty, Sandra Bernklau, thank you so very much for being part of this discussion. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you tonight, and look forward to carrying the conversation forward. So I think you're to do the final closing remarks, so I'll hand back to you.
So, and just on behalf of the Australian Institute of International Affairs Queensland branch, we thank all of you, and thanks for reaching out to us to collaborate on this seminar. Our next seminar is on the 21st of July, and it's with Sarah Davies. How did we go? International relations in the first 6 months of COVID-19. Many of you may know Sarah Davies, who is a global expert is an expert on global health and on women, peace, and security as well. And so she is sure to give us an interesting seminar on this. But just in concluding for tonight, thank you so much to the team of UN Women, Women Pacific, and you know, we don't have, normally there'd be a large audience applause, so I'll just give you my little applause in my room, but thanks so much. And that concludes our seminar tonight. Thank you. Mm-hmm.